The Galactic Confederation had a delightfully bureaucratic way of categorizing planets that would make any tax collector weep with joy. Class A worlds were garden paradises, where the most dangerous thing you might encounter was a mildly stern butterfly. Class B worlds had some weather, maybe a predator or two that could give you a nasty bite if you really tried to annoy it. Class C worlds were where things got interesting, storms that could level cities, creatures that viewed sentient beings as convenient snack food, and gravity that might crush your bones if you looked at it wrong. Then there were the Death Worlds. The official classification was Class D, but everyone just called them Death Worlds because bureaucrats, for all their love of paperwork, occasionally possessed a flair for the dramatic. These were planets where evolution had apparently taken a long, hard look at the concept of survival of the fittest and decided to crank the difficulty setting to nightmare mode. Everything wanted to kill you. The air wanted to kill you. Sometimes even the ground wanted to kill you, and it usually succeeded. Most civilized species took one look at Deathworld data and decided they'd rather spend their time doing literally anything else. Sane beings didn't volunteer to live in places where the local wildlife included things like murder hornets the size of shuttlecraft, or trees that screamed and tried to digest you. It was considered a mark of either incredible stupidity or incredible bad luck to end up on a death world. Naturally, humans called one home. Terra, or Earth as its inhabitants stubbornly insisted on calling it, was a Class D death world that had somehow managed to evolve a species crazy enough to not only survive, but thrive on its surface. The galactic scientific community had been studying humans for decades, trying to figure out how beings from such a hostile environment could appear so average. They were smaller than most sapients, had no natural weapons, no armor plating, no poison sacs, and their reaction time was frankly embarrassing compared to proper predator species. The working theory was that humans were either the galaxy's most elaborate practical joke, or evidence that evolution occasionally got drunk and made decisions it would regret in the morning. This theory was about to be tested at the Nexus Academy, the Confederation's most prestigious military training institution. Located on a pleasant Class B world where the worst thing that might happen to you was a mild sunburn, the Academy trained the elite of the galactic military. The best of the best came here to learn advanced combat techniques, strategic planning, and how to look intimidating while wearing ceremonial armor. For the first time in its 3-century history, the Academy had admitted a human. Zara Chen had arrived 2 weeks ago with minimal fanfare and maximum curiosity from the student body. She was unremarkable by human standards, average height, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of quietly alert expression that suggested she was constantly cataloging escape routes. To her alien classmates, she looked like someone had taken a particularly fragile houseplant and given it opposable thumbs. The Academy's social hierarchy was as rigid as its training regimen. At the top were the apex predator species, the Zephyans with their natural armor and lightning-fast reflexes, the Kororiths with their impressive size and strength, the Thex'hai with their poisonous claws and tactical cunning. Below them were the various mid-tier species, each with their own specializations and natural advantages, and at the very bottom, apparently, was the lone human who looked like she might break if someone sneezed too hard in her direction. Velkarn Thex'hai was everything the Academy's social structure said he should be. A Zephyrian noble from one of the most prestigious military families in the Confederation, he stood nearly 8 feet tall with natural armor plating that could deflect small arms fire. His reflexes were fast enough to snatch projectiles out of the air, his strength could crush steel, and his family had been producing military heroes for generations. He was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of being who should dominate at an institution like the Nexus Academy. He was also, though he would never admit it, deeply concerned about the human. It wasn't that Zara had done anything particularly threatening. She attended classes, participated in training exercises, and generally kept to herself. But there was something about the way she moved, the way she watched everything with those dark eyes, that made Velkarn's predator instincts itch. She reminded him of the hunting cats on his homeworld, small, quiet, and utterly still until the moment they struck. The problem was that she was human, and humans were supposed to be weak. Everyone knew that. The scientific reports were clear. They came from a death world, yes, but they'd obviously survived through luck or hiding, rather than any actual combat ability. The fact that she'd made it into the academy at all was probably some kind of diplomatic gesture or social experiment. Velkarn had been telling himself this for 2 weeks, and he was getting tired of not quite believing it. The opportunity to settle the matter came during Advanced Combat Theory, a class that was supposed to focus on strategic planning but usually devolved into barely controlled sparring matches. Professor Quillon, a grizzled Thex'hai veteran who'd lost half his face in the border wars, was droning on about battlefield adaptability when Velkarn decided he'd had enough of uncertainty. "Professor," he interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that came from generations of genetic superiority. "I think we're all curious about practical applications here. How about a demonstration?" Quillon's remaining eye focused on him with the expression of someone who'd seen this exact scenario play out 1,000 times. "What did you have in mind, Cadet Thex'hai?" Velkarn gestured casually towards Zara, who was sitting in the back row looking like she was mentally cataloguing the structural weak points of the classroom. "Our human classmate here represents an interesting tactical challenge. Small, fragile, from a species with no natural weapons. How would someone like that survive in actual combat?" The classroom went very quiet. This was the kind of moment that Academy legends were made of. Either spectacular victories that would be talked about for years, or spectacular failures that would be talked about for even longer. The other students leaned forward with the eager attention of people who were about to witness either a demonstration of proper hierarchy or a fascinating disaster. Zara looked up from whatever she'd been contemplating and met Velkath's gaze with the kind of expression that suggested she was mildly surprised to find herself part of the conversation. "I'm sorry, were you talking to me?" "I was talking about you," Velkarn replied, standing to his full, impressive height. "I think we'd all benefit from seeing how a Deathworld survivor handles a real combat situation." "A real combat situation," Zara repeated, her tone utterly flat. "Here, in Advanced Combat Theory class." Professor Quillon was beginning to look like someone who was reconsidering his career choices. "Cadets, perhaps we should focus on the theoretical aspects." No, Zara said, standing up with fluid grace that somehow managed to make the movement look both casual and precise. "I think this is educational. What exactly did you have in mind?" Velkarn smiled, showing teeth that could bite through steel cable. "Standard sparring protocols, non-lethal settings, full safety monitoring, just a friendly demonstration of comparative capabilities." The thing about humans, Zara reflected as she followed the class down to the Academy's combat training facility, was that they were very good at reading social situations. It came from living on a planet where misunderstanding the intentions of the local wildlife could result in being eaten, poisoned, or stepped on by something the size of a building. After a few million years of that kind of selective pressure, humans had developed excellent instincts for recognizing when something was trying to kill them. Right now, those instincts were telling her that Velkarn wasn't trying to kill her, he was trying to humiliate her, which was actually much more annoying. The combat facility was a marvel of modern technology, capable of simulating everything from asteroid fields to jungle warfare. For sparring matches, it provided a simple arena with energy barriers that would prevent serious injury and medical scanners that would stop the fight if anyone was in real danger. It was designed to let students push their limits without actually dying, which was generally considered a positive feature. The other students gathered around the observation deck with the enthusiasm of people who were about to witness either a very short fight or a very entertaining one. Betting pools were forming with the kind of efficiency that suggested this was a regular occurrence. The odds were not in Zara's favor. "Standard rules," Professor Quillon announced, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who'd given up trying to maintain order. "First to yield, lose consciousness, or trigger the medical scanners, loses. Weapons are restricted to what you can carry naturally. Arena shields are active, medical monitoring is online." Velkarn stepped into the arena and immediately began stretching in a way that showcased his natural armor and impressive musculature. His movements were fluid and precise, the result of years of training and generations of genetic optimization. He looked like what he was, a perfect predator designed for combat. Zara walked into the arena, rolled her shoulders once, and stood there looking like she was waiting for a bus. "Begin when ready," Quillon called out, though his tone suggested he was already planning the incident report. Velkarn moved like lightning, covering the distance between them in a single bound that would have done credit to a missile. His armored fist swept through the air where Zara's head had been a fraction of a second earlier, producing a sound like a sonic boom as it displaced air. Zara was no longer there. She'd moved at the last possible moment, not with Velkarn's lightning speed but with something that looked almost like precognition. She flowed around his attack like water, her motion so economical that it barely looked like effort. Her hand touched his extended arm as she passed, just a brief contact that couldn't possibly have done anything meaningful. Velkarn spun to follow her movement, his reflexes allowing him to track her repositioning even as his first attack missed. His second strike was even faster, a backhand that should have caught her before she could recover her balance. Instead, she stepped inside his guard and drove her elbow into a gap in his armor plating. The impact was precise, targeted, and delivered with the kind of force that suggested Zara had been holding back significantly during her first 2 weeks at the academy. Velkarn's armor absorbed most of the blow, but the shock of it traveled through his nervous system like an electric current. For just a moment, his reflexes stuttered. Zara used that moment to grab his arm and do something that the Academy's combat instructors would later describe as physically impossible according to standard biomechanical models. She used his own momentum against him, redirecting his mass and speed through a pivot point that existed somewhere around his center of gravity. The result was that 8 feet of armored Zephyran warrior found himself airborne, rotating through space in a way that gravity really didn't approve of. He hit the arena floor with a sound like a dropped cathedral. The watching students went very quiet. This was not going according to the established script. Velkarn rolled to his feet with the kind of grace that came from years of training and a healthy fear of looking foolish in front of his peers. The impact had rattled him, but his armor had absorbed the worst of it. He was stronger, faster, and better armed than his opponent. This was a temporary setback, nothing more. "Lucky," he growled, and launched himself at her again. What followed was a masterclass in the difference between theoretical combat and practical experience. Velkarn fought like someone who had studied warfare from textbooks and training scenarios. His techniques were flawless, his form perfect, and his natural advantages overwhelming. Against any reasonable opponent, he should have won easily. Zara fought like someone who had learned combat from things that actually wanted to kill her. She moved like liquid mercury, never quite where Velkarn expected her to be. When he struck, she wasn't there. When he tried to grapple, she slipped away. When he attempted to use his reach advantage, she was suddenly inside his guard, doing things to his nervous system that definitely weren't covered in the Academy's training manuals. The thing about Deathworlds, Zara reflected as she avoided another lightning-fast strike, was that they didn't care about your training regimen. The wildlife on Earth hadn't read the textbooks about proper combat technique. They just wanted to eat you, and they were very good at it. After a few million years of dealing with creatures that could kill you in increasingly creative ways, humans had developed a very practical approach to not dying. It involved being extremely good at reading an opponent's intentions, exploiting any weakness available, and having the kind of pain tolerance that came from living on a planet where everything hurt all the time anyway. Velkarn's natural armor was impressive, but it had joints. His reflexes were lightning fast, but they followed predictable patterns. His strength was overwhelming, but it required leverage and balance to be effective, and his confidence was absolute, which was rapidly becoming a liability. The turning point came when Velkarn overextended on a particularly aggressive strike. He'd been growing increasingly frustrated with his inability to land a solid hit, and his latest attack had more power behind it than precision. Zara stepped aside with minimal effort, grabbed his extended arm, and demonstrated why humans had developed such flexible joints. The sound of Velkarn's shoulder dislocating was audible throughout the arena. His roar of pain and rage shook the observation deck's windows. He spun toward Zara with his remaining functional arm, claws extended, ready to end this humiliation with overwhelming force. Zara looked at him with the expression of someone who had just realized they were dealing with a particularly stubborn problem. She sighed, stepped forward, and hit him in the solar plexus with the kind of precision that suggested she'd been studying Zephyranian anatomy during her spare time. Velkarn's nervous system, already stressed from the dislocated shoulder, decided it had experienced enough excitement for one day. He collapsed to the arena floor with a sound like a falling tree, his body's automatic safety systems shutting down to prevent further damage. The medical scanners immediately activated, flooding the arena with diagnostic beams and triggering the emergency protocols. Within seconds, medical technicians were swarming around Velkarn's unconscious form, while automated systems began the process of stabilizing his injuries. Zara stood in the center of the arena, breathing slightly harder than normal but otherwise appearing completely unaffected by the experience. She looked around at the shocked faces of her classmates with the expression of someone who was mildly puzzled by their reactions. "Is he going to be all right?" she asked Professor Quillon, who was staring at her with the expression of someone who was reconsidering everything he thought he knew about combat theory. "He'll be fine," Quillon replied automatically, his voice carrying the kind of professional calm that came from years of dealing with training accidents. "Dislocated shoulder, some bruising, possible concussion. Nothing that a few hours in a medical pod won't fix." Zara nodded, apparently satisfied with this assessment. "Good. I was worried I might have hit him too hard." The medical team was already loading Velkarn onto a transport gurney, his unconscious form looking somehow smaller than it had when he'd been standing at his full, impressive height. The medical scanners were chattering about bone density, nerve response, and recommended treatment protocols. The prognosis was good. He'd make a full recovery with no lasting effects. Physically anyway, his ego was probably going to need more extensive rehabilitation. As the medical team wheeled Velkarn away toward the Academy's medical facility, the other students began to disperse with the kind of shell-shocked expressions that suggested they were going to be processing this experience for quite some time. The betting pools were being settled with unusual quiet, and several students were making notes in their personal files about the need to revise their assumptions about human combat capabilities. Zara walked over to where Professor Quillon was standing, still looking like someone who was trying to reconcile what he'd just witnessed with everything he thought he knew about warfare. "Professor," she said, her tone politely curious, "was that the kind of demonstration you were looking for?" Quillon looked at her for a long moment, then at the scorch marks on the arena floor where Velkarn had landed, then back at her. "Cadet Chen," he said finally, "I think we're going to need to revise some of our curriculum." 3 hours later, Velkarn woke up in Medical Bay 7 with the kind of headache that suggested his brain had been used as a percussion instrument. The medical pod had done its work efficiently. His shoulder was back in its proper socket, the bruising had been healed, and his nervous system had been restored to full functionality. Physically, he was in perfect condition. Mentally, he was trying to process the fact that he'd been comprehensively defeated by someone who looked like a strong breeze might knock her over. Dr. Yathara, the Academy's chief medical officer, was reviewing his charts with the kind of professional interest that suggested she'd found something fascinating in the data. "Interesting case," she murmured, her 4 eyes scanning the readouts with mechanical precision. "No permanent damage, but the pattern of injuries suggests exposure to a combat style I've never encountered before." "How long was I unconscious?" Velkarn asked, his voice carrying a hoarseness that had nothing to do with physical injury. 3 hours, 12 minutes, Dr. Yathara replied without looking up from her charts. "Normal recovery time for neural shock of this magnitude. You should be cleared for light duty within the day." Velkarn sat up slowly, testing his range of motion and finding everything working normally. The medical pod had repaired the physical damage, but it couldn't fix the larger problem, the fact that everything he'd believed about his own capabilities had just been thoroughly demolished. "Doctor," he said carefully, "the human, Chen, is she normal for her species?" Dr. Yathara finally looked up from her charts, her expression carrying the kind of clinical interest that suggested she'd been wondering the same thing. "That's a fascinating question, Cadet. Human physiology is still poorly understood by galactic medical science. Their baseline capabilities appear to be far more variable than most species." "Variable how?" "Their homeworld conditioning primarily. Humans who grow up on Terra develop adaptations that don't show up in standard medical scans. Enhanced proprioception, improved pain tolerance, reflexes that operate on predictive rather than reactive principles. They're essentially walking examples of evolutionary adaptation to hostile environments." Velkarn absorbed this information with the kind of attention that suggested he was filing it away for future reference. "So she's not unusually strong for a human?" Actually, according to her medical files, she's fairly average by human standards, which raises some interesting questions about what average means when you're dealing with a species that evolved on a Class D Deathworld. The implications of this were staggering. If Zara was average by human standards, then the Confederation's assessment of human capabilities was not just wrong, it was catastrophically wrong. The scientific models that classified humans as a weak species were based on data that apparently missed the most important factors. "Doctor," Velkarn said slowly, "how many humans are there in the Confederation?" Dr. Yathara consulted her files with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd been anticipating this question. Current estimates put the human population at approximately 12 billion individuals, with colonies on 47 worlds. They're one of the fastest growing species in the Confederation. 12 billion individuals who had been systematically underestimated by every major galactic institution. 12 billion individuals who came from a world that had spent millions of years trying to kill them, and who had not only survived but thrived. 12 billion individuals who were now spread across the galaxy, quietly going about their business while everyone else continued to think of them as harmless. Velkarn was beginning to understand that the Confederation might have made a very significant error in judgment. Over the following days, word of the sparring match spread through the academy with the kind of efficiency that suggested the student body had been desperate for something interesting to talk about. The official reports described it as a training exercise with unexpected outcomes, but the actual details painted a rather different picture. The Academy's combat instructors found themselves facing a philosophical crisis. Their entire curriculum was based on the assumption that natural advantages, size, strength, speed, armor, were the primary determinants of combat effectiveness. The idea that technique, experience, and adaptability might be more important than raw physical capability was revolutionary and deeply uncomfortable. Several instructors requested access to human combat records, hoping to understand what they were dealing with. What they found was a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history fighting things that were bigger, stronger, faster, and better armed than they were. Humans had survived not by being the apex predator, but by being more adaptable than anything that tried to eat them. The Academy's tactical computer models were hastily updated to include new variables for Deathworld conditioning and adaptive combat response. The results were disturbing. Human combat effectiveness was approximately 3 times higher than previously calculated, and this was based on incomplete data from a species that had barely begun to explore its full potential. Zara, meanwhile, seemed completely unaware of the minor revolution she'd triggered. She attended classes, participated in training exercises, and generally conducted herself with the same quiet competence she'd shown since arriving. If anything, she seemed relieved that the other students had stopped treating her like a fragile curiosity and started treating her like a potential threat. Which was, she reflected, probably a more accurate assessment anyway. The Academy's social hierarchy underwent a rapid and significant restructuring. Students who had previously ignored or dismissed Zara began approaching her with the kind of careful respect usually reserved for dangerous wildlife. Study groups formed around her, not to help her keep up with the curriculum but to learn from her unique perspective on combat theory. Velkarn, once he'd been cleared for duty, found himself in the uncomfortable position of being the cautionary tale that everyone else learned from. His defeat at the hands of a weak human had become required reading in several courses, though the instructors were careful to frame it as a lesson in the dangers of underestimating opponents, rather than a personal failure. To his credit, Velkarn took this development with more grace than might have been expected from someone of his background. He approached Zara a week after the incident, when she was eating lunch alone in the Academy's cafeteria. "May I sit?" he asked, his tone carrying none of the casual arrogance that had characterized their previous interactions. Zara looked up from her meal, some kind of protein synthesis that the Academy's food processors had optimistically labeled stew, and nodded toward the empty chair across from her. "Sure." Velkarn sat down carefully, his movements suggesting he was still processing the fact that the small human across from him had folded him like origami. "I wanted to apologize," he said formally. "My behavior was inappropriate and based on ignorance." "Apology accepted," Zara replied, her tone suggesting she'd already moved past the incident. "Though I have to ask, what exactly were you trying to prove?" Velkarn considered this question with the kind of careful attention that suggested he'd been asking himself the same thing. I suppose I wanted to confirm that the natural order still made sense, that strength and speed and armor still mattered, that someone like me was still relevant. And now? Now I'm beginning to think that the natural order is more complicated than I was taught. He paused, then added, "You fight like someone who's done this before. Not sparring, I mean, real combat." Zara took a bite of her stew and made a face that suggested the food processors still had room for improvement. "Earth isn't a gentle place," she said finally. "If you grow up there, you learn to handle things that want to hurt you. Or you don't grow up at all." But the reports said humans were weak, non-aggressive, suited for support roles rather than frontline combat. The reports, Zara said with a slight smile, were written by people who never tried to survive a summer in the Australian outback, or a winter in Siberia, or a casual stroll through the Amazon rainforest. Earth has a very practical way of teaching its children about survival. Velkarn absorbed this information with the kind of attention that suggested he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about galactic species classifications. "So when you said, 'I hit you too hard,' I meant it. On Earth, if you hit something hard enough to damage it, it either runs away or it escalates the conflict. Since you couldn't run away, I was worried you might escalate." The implications of this were staggering. Zara hadn't been fighting at full capacity. She'd been holding back to avoid triggering what her instincts told her would be a more dangerous response. The defeat that had shattered Velkarn's worldview had been delivered with the human equivalent of a gentle correction. "How much were you holding back?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Zara considered this question while poking at her stew with the kind of expression that suggested she was trying to identify the protein source. "Hard to say. Earth has a lot of different environments, and they all teach different lessons. What works in the Arctic doesn't work in the desert. What works in the forest doesn't work in the mountains. Humans learn to adapt." "But approximately." "Well," Zara said, apparently deciding that the stew was probably safe to eat, "let's just say that if you'd actually been trying to kill me, I would have responded differently." Velkarn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Academy's environmental controls. The casual way she'd said it, the complete lack of boasting or threat, somehow made it more terrifying than any amount of posturing would have been. "I see," he said finally. "And this is normal for humans?" "More or less. We're all products of our environment, and our environment spent a long time trying to kill us. The ones who couldn't adapt didn't survive to reproduce." The conversation continued for another hour, with Zara patiently explaining the basics of human evolutionary history, and Velkarn gradually coming to terms with the fact that his species' entire understanding of galactic power dynamics was based on incomplete information. By the time they parted ways, both had gained a new perspective on the nature of strength and the dangers of assumptions. The Academy's monthly combat rankings were posted a week later, with results that surprised absolutely no one who had been paying attention. Zara Chen, the supposedly weak human from the Deathworld, had achieved the highest score in the Academy's history. Her performance had been so far above the previous record that the evaluation computers had initially flagged it as a data error. The response from the Academy's administration was swift and comprehensive. New courses were added to the curriculum covering Deathworld adaptations and non-conventional combat techniques. Exchange programs were established with human military institutions, and, most significantly, the Academy's entrance requirements were revised to account for the fact that traditional measures of combat effectiveness were apparently inadequate for evaluating certain species. The ripple effects spread far beyond the Academy. The Confederation's military leadership found themselves facing the uncomfortable realization that they had been systematically underestimating one of their member species. Emergency committees were formed to reassess human military capabilities, defense contracts were quietly renegotiated, and somewhere in the depths of the Confederation's bureaucracy, the official classification of Earth was upgraded from Class D Deathworld to Class D Deathworld. Approach with extreme caution. Zara, meanwhile, continued to attend classes and eat terrible cafeteria food, apparently oblivious to the fact that her existence had triggered a minor revolution in galactic military thinking. When asked about her newfound fame, she simply shrugged and pointed out that she was just trying to graduate with decent grades. though she did mention, almost as an afterthought, that she was looking forward to the advanced combat courses. The basic curriculum was interesting, but she was hoping for something more challenging. The Academy's instructors, upon hearing this, quietly began updating their insurance policies. 6 months later, Velkarn graduated from the Academy with honors and a completely revised understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. His final thesis, Reconsidering Strength, Lessons from Deathworld Combat Theory, became required reading at military academies throughout the Confederation. He went on to serve with distinction in the Confederation Navy, where his ability to accurately assess non-conventional threats made him invaluable in first-contact situations. Zara graduated at the top of her class, turned down several high-profile military positions, and returned to Earth to work in her family's agricultural business. When asked why she'd chosen farming over a military career, she explained that after spending years in the sterile environment of the Academy, she missed the simple challenge of convincing plants to grow in soil that was actively trying to kill them. The Confederation's military historians would later mark this period as the beginning of the human integration era, when the galaxy's understanding of warfare was fundamentally transformed by the inclusion of Deathworld perspectives. What had started as a simple sparring match between two students had revealed the existence of an entire category of combat capability that had been hiding in plain sight. And somewhere in the depths of space, on worlds that were still classified as uninhabitable by galactic standards, other species were quietly adapting to environments that would horrify civilized beings. They were learning the same lessons that humans had learned millions of years ago, that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest or the most heavily armed. It was about being the most adaptable. The galaxy, it seemed, was about to become a much more interesting place.